On the shore of the French Riviera, about halfway between Marseille and the Italian border, stood a large, proud, rose-colored hotel. Deferential palms cooled its flushed facade, and before it stretched a short, dazzling beach. Now it has become a summer resort of notable and fashionable people. In 1925, it was almost deserted after its English clientele went north in April. Only the cupolas of a dozen old villas rotted like water lilies among the massed pines between Gosse's Hôtel des Étrangers and Cannes, 5 miles away. The hotel and its bright tan prayer rug of a beach were one. In the early morning, the distant image of Cannes, the pink and cream of old fortifications, the purple Alp that bounded Italy, were cast across the water and lay quavering in the ripples and rings sent up by sea plants through the clear shallows.
Scott Fitzgerald's dazzling shore, with its palm-cooled hotels and debauched old villas, has attracted writers for over 100 years, ever since the minor poet Stéphane Léager gave it a glowing name in 1887, La Côte d'Azur. Since then, writers such as Fitzgerald have both responded to and enhanced the myth of the Riviera. The Riviera began its resort life as a temporary refuge from the cholera for Henry Lord Brougham of the four-wheel carriage fame. He rested there in 1834, unable to cross into pest-ridden Italy, calling on his friends for company. By the 1860s, it had become a kind of vaudeville stage for full-time English and Russian aristocrats. But it was the mighty midget of the British royal family who invested it with top-drawer regality. Queen Victoria wintered there from 1887 to 1894. A number of more frisky ladies soon joined the parade. La Belle Otero, the gypsy dancer known as La Grande Horizontale. Isadora Duncan, the exotic, erotic dancer, was throttled by her own scarf on the Promenade des Anglais in 1927, and Coco Chanel, the queen of luxurious simplicity, led the new 20s fad for getting a tan. It may have been fashionable, but the Riviera was for a long time a fairly simple place.
When I first came here in, I suppose, the early 20s, on a holiday, there was the old hotel here, and I thought it was the most ravishing place I'd ever seen. Little bay, and then the cliffs going right up behind it.
Writer Lesley Blanch remembers the coast when some of its original personality was still intact.
It was an old-fashioned place that had a traditional way of living. There were fishermen here, along the beaches. The water lapped up where the cars run now. There were a couple of donkeys where the hill goes up to the frontier. There was only one road up to the frontier then. And some old donkeys were there for people who couldn't do the walk. The glamour came back into this part of the world in about 23. I think the real high glamour came back when Diaghilev brought his ballet here to Monte Carlo. Then it was superb. But the glamour was in the ballet and the people it attracted. Tourists there really weren't then. Not much.
They drove along the Riviera, the delta of many rivers. The chauffeur, a Russian Tsar of the period of Ivan the Terrible, was a self-appointed guide, and the resplendent names Cannes, Nice, Monte Carlo began to glow through their torpid camouflage, whispering of old kings come here to dine or die, of Rajas tossing Buddha's eyes to English ballerinas, of Russian princes turning the weeks into Baltic twilights in the lost caviar days. Most of all, there was the scent of the Russians along the coast, their closed bookshops and grocery stores. 11 years before, when the season ended in April, the doors of the Orthodox Church had been locked, and the sweet champagnes they favored had been put away until their return. We'll be back next season, they said. But this was premature, for they were never coming back anymore.
Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald came to the Riviera to stay with their friends Gerald and Sara Murphy, who had rebuilt a villa on Cap d'Antibes, which they called Villa America. Here they played host to many of the expatriate writers of the day, among them New Yorker wit Robert Benchley, the Hemingways, and John Dos Passos. Another American writer, Calvin Tompkins, who knew the Murphys, understands how Fitzgerald became fascinated by them.
The Murphys were just this extremely unusual pair of people who seemed to complement each other in all sorts of different ways, people with whom everybody felt instantly and permanently at home. There was this this thing that Fitzgerald was so aware of and wrote about so beautifully in Tender is the Night. They were tremendously interested in other people. This is the thing that was constant in their life. And I think this was a conscious creation on Gerald's part. He took a really intense interest in other people, and he had this incredible ability to anticipate what people might like, what people might be interested in, what people might want, and to provide it with such a tact and style that you weren't even aware that there was this kind of process going on. And Sara, quite different. Sara, spontaneous, extremely warm, terribly fond of her friends. Picasso painted more than 200 pictures of Sara. He was so fascinated with her look, her style, and the way she moved, the way she wore her string of pearls slung down her back on the beach. She said that it was good for them to get the sun.
Nearest her, on the other side, a young woman lay under a roof of umbrellas, making out a list of things from a book open on the sand. Her bathing suit was pulled off her shoulders, and her back, a ruddy orange-brown, set off by a string of creamy pearls, shone in the sun. Her face was hard and lovely and pitiful. Her eyes met Rosemary's, but did not see her. Beyond her was a fine man, in a jockey cap and red-striped tights. Then the woman Rosemary had seen on the raft, who looked back at her, seeing her. Then a man with a long face and a golden leonine head, with blue tights and no hat, talking very seriously to an unmistakably Latin young man in black tights, both of them picking at little pieces of seaweed in the sand. She thought they were mostly Americans, but something made them unlike the Americans she had known of late.
For the next decade, the Riviera welcomed the bright young things, the famous and the glamorous of the age.
There was no one at Antibes this summer, except me, Zelda, the Valentinos, the Murphys, Miss Donguet, Rex Ingram, Dos Passos, Alice Terry, the McLeishes, Charlie Brackett, Maud Kahn, Esther Murphy, Marguerite Namara, E. Phillips Oppenheim, man, the violinist, Floyd Dell, Max and Crystal Eastman, ex-Premier Orlando, Etienne de Beaumont. Just a real place to rough it, an escape from all the world.
We're all alone, no chaperone can get our number. The world's in slumber, let's misbehave.
What was lovely, when you came by train, the Trembler, that was something, that did have magic. Of course it did. The great ritual was to have dinner at the Gare de Lyon before you left, where there was a really wonderful restaurant, famous food. It's very French, that, you see, to have some of the best food in Paris at the railway station. I can't think of such a type of meal from Waterloo or anywhere else in England. And then you'd tear out when the whistle was almost going, and the chocolate uniforms of men would be sort of scolding like nannies and getting you in. And then the train would go. And then if you'd had your dinner, you see, you went to your lovely plushy compartment, and you went to sleep with every luxury. And I personally adore sleeping in the train. I loved it. In the morning you woke up and you were running through vineyards with a golden light on everything. You were running before Marseille. That was a magical moment.
I found it so glamorous, you know, because first of all there was kind of a perfume in the air. If you haven't been to the coast when it's February, you don't know, because February is the time when the mimosa comes out and the violets are there.
Dorothy Sinead arrived on the Riviera as a 17-year-old in the mid-30s and still lives in Cannes.
I remember walking along the Promenade des Anglais and this wafts of perfume coming. There was the mimosa perfume, and then the women. Everybody seemed to be perfumed. And the women seemed to me quite different from anything I'd ever seen in England. I think there's something about the sun that does it, because, I mean, I used to have chilblains in Brighton. Don't forget, in those times, we didn't have central heating in England. We had coal fires, and of course, unless you sat right on top of it, you were freezing. And the men were, imagine in those days, the men would be wearing white trousers, flannels, we're in January, February, you know, and these brown and white shoes. I always remember that. My mother was great fun. She was younger than my father, you see, and we used to go dancing. I mean, she used to accompany me to these tea dances. Now, you could dance all the time. There would be tea dances, cocktail dances, and then evening dances. Of course, I didn't stay out too late. Well, I never couldn't go to nightclubs. First of all, you couldn't go in the casino, I was longing to go into the gambling rooms and see what it was like, but you couldn't go until you were 21, you see. They wouldn't let you in. My father and mother would sometimes go into the gambling room, play roulette or something, and I would sit outside in the hall waiting for them. And of course, in the hall were other young people like I was who weren't allowed into, and there was dancing there. I remember we stayed for a couple of months. You know, you didn't come down for a week because it was too far, the journey.
In her blue dress, with her cheeks lightly flushed, her blue eyes and her gold curls pinned up as though for the first time, pinned up to be out of the way for her flight, Mrs. Raddick's daughter might have just dropped from this radiant heaven. Mrs. Raddick's timid, faintly astonished, but deeply admiring glance looked as if she believed it too. But the daughter didn't appear any too pleased. Why should she, to have alighted on the steps of the casino? Indeed, she was bored as though heaven had been full of casinos, with snuffy old saints for croupiers and crowns to play with. "You don't mind taking Henny," said Mrs. Raddick. "Sure you don't. There's the car, and you'll have tea, and we'll be back here on this step, right here, in an hour. You see, I want her to go in. She's not been before, and it's worth seeing. I feel it wouldn't be fair to her." "Oh, shut up, Mother," she said wearily. "Come along. Don't talk so much. And your bag's open. You'll be losing all your money again." "I'm sorry, darling," said Mrs. Raddick. "Oh, do come in. I want to make money," said the impatient voice. "It's all jolly well for you, but I'm broke. Here, take 50 francs, darling. Take 100.
Katherine Mansfield had come to the Riviera because of her ailing health, as did many British with tuberculosis. The stories she wrote about the place and its population of expatriates showed a sharp eye for snobbery and social climbing, as well as a recognition of the poignancy of exile, as in the story Miss Brill.
Although it was so brilliantly fine, the blue sky powdered with gold and the great spots of light like white wine splashed over the Jardin Public, Miss Brill was glad that she had decided on her fur. The air was motionless, but when you opened your mouth there was just a faint chill, like a chill from a glass of iced water before you sip, and now and again a leaf came drifting from nowhere, from the sky. Miss Brill put up her hand and touched her fur. Dear little thing. It was nice to feel it again. She had taken it out of its box that afternoon, shaken out the moth powder, given it a good brush, and rubbed the life back into the dim little eyes. There were a number of people out this afternoon, far more than last Sunday, and the band sounded louder and gayer. That was because the season had begun, for although the band played all the year round on Sundays, out of season it was never the same. It was like someone playing with only the family to listen. It didn't care how it played if there weren't any strangers present.
Mansfield loved Menton, where she lived in the Villa Isola Bella, and from where she wrote ecstatic letters back to her lover, John Middleton Murray.
Darling Bogey, kissing is a queer thing. I was standing under a tree just now, a tree that is shedding exquisite golden yellow leaves all over my garden path, and suddenly one leaf made the most ethereal advances to me, and in another moment we were kissing each other. Through the silvery branches one can see the deep blue sky, lapis lazuli. I think the time has come, it really has come, for us to do a little courting. Have we ever had time to stand under trees and tell our love? Or to sit down by the sea and make fragrant zones for each other. The tea roses are in flower. Do you know the peculiar, exquisite scent of a tea rose? Do you know how the bud opens, so unlike other roses, and how deep red the thorns are, and almost purple the leaves? If I live here much longer, I shall become a bush of Daphne, or you'll find no one to welcome you but a jasmine. Perhaps it's the effect of receiving the sun every morning. Très intime. The lady clad only in a black paper fan. But you must come here. You must live here in the south and forget greyness. It is divine here, no less.
Another kind of sensuality, the pleasure of Provencal food, later introduced to the British by Elizabeth David, features in Sybil Bedford's pre-war novels, based closely on her own life, which included many happy years spent growing up in the Riviera.
In the back street restaurant where she ate her dinner 6 nights a week, Flavia was happy again. Dinner usually started with some substantial and high-flavoured soup, fish soup, bean soup, mussels. The other courses were made dishes. Monday, pot-au-feu, Friday, aioli and brandade de morue. On other days, according to what was cheap and good, not necessarily best, in the market. Tomate farcie, friture de poisson, gratin d'aubergine, paupiette de veau, or civet de lapin. The kind of menu that these days is commonplace in every other London bistro. At Chez Auguste, the cooking was honest and without attempt at elegant variations. It was cooking meant for people who ordered, ate, and paid for these dishes because they knew them, liked them, and knew what they were entitled to expect. The wine provided was good wine of its kind, a red 11 degree of last autumn's vintage, decently made, that came from a family property in the Var.
In 1928, Somerset Maugham bought a villa on the coast. He loved the landscape and was a connoisseur of the sophisticated social life which featured in stories like The Lion's Skin.
The winter passed into spring, and the gardens on the Riviera were ablaze with colour. The hillsides were primly gay with wild flowers. The spring passed into summer. In the towns along the Riviera, the streets were hot with a bright, eager heat that made the blood run faster, and women walked about in great straw hats and pyjamas. The beaches were crowded. Men in trunks and women almost naked lay in the sun. In the evening, the bars on the Croisette were thronged by a restless, chattering crowd, as many-coloured as the flowers of spring.
Well, he would never stay in England after the scandal with his boyfriend. He never wanted to set foot in it, and he wasn't a man to do without extreme comforts and being able to lord it.
The arrogant Somerset Maugham, in the splendour of his Villa Moresque, imposed his personality on the Riviera, as Lesley Blanch remembers.
It was a very worldly place, wonderful climate, of course, wonderful servants, wonderful food, and he lived barricaded in behind all that sort of fleur-de-fou, you know. It was a peculiar atmosphere. He could be amusing and he could be bad-tempered. I remember he said to me, I'd just written The Wilder Shores of Love. It was my first book. And he said, well, my dear girl, if you sell 8,000 copies in New York, you'll be bloody lucky. And exactly what I did so. So I sent him a card and said, well, I've been bloody lucky. He laughed.
Maugham was a snob, but he put his knowledge of the Riviera socialites to good use.
It was a representative Riviera party. There was an English lord and his lady, long and lean, both of them, who were prepared to dine with anyone who would give them a free meal. They were certain to be as tight as drums before midnight. There was a gaunt Scotchwoman, with a face like a Peruvian mask that has been battered by the storms of 10 centuries, and her English husband. Though a broker by profession, he was bluff, military, and hearty. He gave you an impression of such integrity that you were almost more sorry for him than for yourself when the good thing he had put you on to as a special favour turned out to be a dud. There was an Italian countess, who was neither Italian nor a countess, but played a beautiful game of bridge. And there was a Russian prince, who was ready to make Mrs. Barrett a princess, and in the meantime sold champagne motor cars and old masters on commission.
You know, everyone's here frightfully gay. You know, nobody cares what people say. Now, though the Riviera is really much queerer than Rome at its height, on Wednesday night I went to a marvellous party with Nunu and Nada and Nell. You know, it was in the fresh air, and we went as we were. And we stayed as we were, which was hell.
After the Second World War, Saint-Tropez became the playground of the vulgarly famous. The Cannes Film Festival, starting in 1946, brought hordes of starlets and film fans to the Croisette, and in the general opinion of the residents, things went badly downhill. However, there was still some glamour left.
I put on my dressing gown and went out onto my balcony. The front of the casino was floodlit. It looked like a cross between a Balkan palace and a super cinema, with the absurd statuary sitting on the edge of the green roof, looking down at the big portico and the commissionaires. Everything stuck out in the white light, as though projected in 3D. In the harbour, the yachts were all lit up, and a rocket burst in the air over the hill of Monaco. It was so stupidly romantic, I could have wept.
Graham Greene's Loser Takes All. Greene lived in Antibes for most of the last 25 years of his life, but he was no social butterfly. Colonel Ronnie Challoner, ex-honorary consul in Nice, was his close friend, and now lives in Greene's Antibes apartment.
He was a very distant person. He didn't like people a great deal. I think he liked France, because he liked the food and the wine, the fish, and so on. But he never integrated into it at all.
It was February in Antibes. Gusts of rain blew along the ramparts, and the emaciated statues on the terrace of the Chateau Grimaldi dripped with wet, and there was a sound, absent during the flat blue days of summer, the continual rustle below the ramparts of the small surf. All along the court, the summer restaurants were closed, but lights shone in Félix au Port, and one Peugeot of the latest model stood in the parking rank. The bare masts of the abandoned yachts stuck up like toothpicks, and the last plane in the winter service dropped in a flicker of green, red, and yellow lights like Christmas tree baubles towards the airport of Nice. This was the Antibes I always enjoyed, and I was disappointed to find I was not alone in the restaurant, as I was most nights of the week.
But he loved Antibes because of its quietness, 100 metres away from the station, and he loved trains. 100 metres down the road to Felix, where the fish was good, and so on. Felix is a restaurant on the port in the archway going into the old part of Antibes, Vieille Antibes. Always Graham and Yvonne, or Graham himself, would be there in the corner. And that's where he listened to conversations and occasionally made a little note and so on. Then came back here and scribbled his notes here.
I didn't want to hear them. I wanted to work. Rochester's relations with the actress, Mrs. Barry, were my concern at the moment, but it is almost impossible in a foreign land not to listen to one's own tongue. French I could have accepted as a kind of background noise, but I could not fail to overhear English.
My dear, guess who's written to me now? Alec? No, Mrs. Clarenty. What does the old hag want? She objects to the mural in her bedroom. But, Stephen, it's divine. Alec's never done anything better. The dead fawn. I think she wants something more nubile and less necrophilous. The old lecher.
His short stories are basically his reportage on the south of France, Antibes, Monte Carlo, and so on. And he has this brilliant way of evoking the atmosphere of the south of France in so few words.
The old veterans sat around the tables with their charts and their pads and their pencils, making notes of every number. They looked, some of them, like opium smokers, dehydrated. There was a very tiny, brown old lady with a straw hat of 40 years ago, covered in daisies. Her left claw rested on the edge of the table like the handle of an umbrella, and her right held a chip worth 100 francs.
Well, gambling at the casino hasn't changed, but Scott Fitzgerald's tan prayer rug of a beach is teeming with bodies now, and we remember Zelda's words of 70 years ago.
Now all the gay, decorative people have left, taking with them the sense of carnival and impending disaster that colored this summer.
The party's over now, the dawn is drawing very nigh. Let's creep away from the day and allow me to say goodbye.
Exhaust fumes now smother the scent of mimosa, but it's just possible to catch a glimpse of the Riviera which writers like Sybil Bedford delighted in, and even believe that it may still exist somewhere around a corner.
The clarity of those mornings of spring and early summer, the second year at Saint-Jean, the sense of peace, slow time, the long day to come, the summer, the year, the years. Wide windows, not yet shuttered at that hour, opened from the circular whitewashed room on slopes of olives and the distant shimmering bay. The air, still light and cool, already held the promise of the dry, unwavering heat of noon. Midday was marked by another stillness, different in quality. Flavia shut her books. Quickly she left the room, ran downstairs, left the tower. Outside struck the full noon blaze of Provence. She walked down the hillside, the last part of it of a scramble. The air smelt of hot stone and thyme. The bay was empty. The French had gone home to eat.